Welcome everybody to Spirituality Adventures. This is a non-judgmental place to explore spirituality, and we're so glad you're here. This is a viewer and listener supported podcast, so we greatly appreciate your support. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Be sure and like, share, and subscribe to any of the social media content platforms that you're using. And then if you go to our website, spiritualityadventures.com, you can make a one-time donation, or with a monthly subscription, you'll gain access to our bonus content. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you for tuning in. All right, welcome everybody to Spirituality Adventures. Thanks for tuning in. Today we have Joel Barrett with us. And Joel and I have just recently kind of met on Zoom just a few months ago.
Through a mutual friend, yes.
Yeah, through a mutual friend. Actually, several mutual friends.
Yeah.
But Pam Hausner was the one that really wanted me to meet you and introduce you. And Pam was one of my early interviews, and I interviewed her on mindful meditation stuff. And I'm in one of her, she's my meditation teacher.
That's great.
Right? So
I
anyway,
love Pam. She's awesome.
I do too. So, so Joel grew up in a very conservative Baptist church.
Sure did, yeah.
Like a Baptist church that would consider Southern Baptist liberal.
That's right, yeah.
Which I understand that, but most people who aren't from our world don't understand that there's actually Baptists that think Southern Baptists are too liberal, right?
People in this area especially understand this reference. I always say, just think the softer side of the Westboro Baptist Church.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of my prouder moments is they came and protested my church.
There you go.
You know, so I was like,
that's a gold star moment.
I'm like, I'm going to take a picture, frame this one, man. You know, anyway.
I'm just not on their radar. Otherwise, I'm sure they'd be out front right now.
Right, exactly. Yeah, but yeah, and then you were a Baptist pastor.
Yes.
You have just recently last year put out your book, Godly but Gay. And I would highly recommend this. We'll refer everybody to your websites and everything at the end. But excellent book, and I love the vulnerability, the honesty, and even the humility and the love that you expressed throughout this journey.
Thank you.
Even at the points of pain, deep pain, deep shame, you still managed to, I think, handle very gracefully, you know.
And when I came out, I kind of had this moment of going, I'd lived so much of my life, you know, in the closet, but like also just closed off. And so when I came out, I was like, I'm willing to be a spokesperson. Like a lot of people can't or won't. And I was like, I'm comfortable talking. And so I just decided I was going to share it all. And because I wish somebody had, there probably were some people, but I wasn't aware of them, but I wish somebody had so that I could have read something like that. So I'm like, you know what? I am willing to just bear it all and hopefully help others find hope, inspiration, as well as education for people that are not exposed to a world like this, both from a religious standpoint as well as a closeted gay man to gay culture. So I wanted to help other people also get a window into a world that was unfamiliar to them.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And I feel like, you know, it's like when people listen to me preach, they always felt like they knew me really well, but didn't actually, you know.
Right.
And then, you know, I've read your book now, and I'm like going, I can connect with you at so many points. And I'll bring out some of those points along the way. I
usually tell people you're going to learn more about me than you ever wanted to know.
Right, exactly. But what's interesting to me, I've interviewed now. I interviewed Calvin Arsenia, Paul Smith. Do you know Paul here in town?
I don't believe so.
Paul pastored Broadway Baptist Church here,
okay.
And he didn't really come to grips with his gayness until he was like 60.
Okay, yeah.
And, his granddaughter went to my church, but and we've been colleagues in the city for years, and so he finally, you know, told his wife he was gay, and then got a divorce, and then navigated that world. He's with partner now, but a really brilliant man who's written a lot of books. But I remember asking Paul, I said, when did you first realize you were gay? And he was like so suppressed that he wouldn't even let himself go there until he had done so much emotional work, and then that came out later. So he discovered it late in life.
It's different for everybody.
Yeah.
It really is. I always say there's not a right time or a right way. The thing is, it's a journey that you should always be on, of living as authentically as you can in every moment. So if you're committed to that, you'll figure things out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good. But like, I would say most of the people I've interviewed were like you, in that from their earliest puberty stages, they had an attraction to the opposite sex. Never felt same sex.
Same sex. Yeah.
Did I? Yeah. Sorry. I'll get my terms confused. You correct me.
Well, I mean, it's the same with anybody. As like, when someone says, "When did you know you're gay?" It was like, "Well, when did you know you were straight?"
Right.
Right. I mean, it's not any different, and we all are on a journey of figuring out what turns us on, what we're attracted to, what we're, and that changes throughout time, throughout life. But most people, I would say, have some clue
early on
from an early age. Yeah.
It seems that way. And then you're in this extraordinarily conservative movement, this conservative, we would call it fundamental Baptist.
We wore that label Baptist. Proudly.
Right.
Yes. In fact, if you were a fighting fundamentalist, that was even better.
Right. Right.
Sin-fearing God-fearing, sin-hating, premillennial. You had a whole string of words that preachers would enjoy rattling off, and it was kind of like the more you were against, the better a Christian you were.
Yeah. And so what's interesting is I would have never identified with that branch of Baptist life. I grew up, my dad grew up in Wichita as an American Baptist, which was much more liberal.
Oh yeah.
And then when he moved to Kansas City, he there weren't as many American Baptists, so he ended up going to a Southern Baptist church. And my dad's 87, he's still alive, and he's a wonderful guy. But I always tease him, like, you weren't a very good Southern Baptist. He smoked cigars. He'd cuss every now and then. He loved to dance. It's like, because even in my church, you weren't supposed to smoke. You weren't supposed to dance. You weren't supposed to drink. You weren't supposed to. You weren't supposed to.
Yeah. Don't. What was it? Don't drink. Don't dance. Don't chew. Don't go with the girls that do.
That's right. That's right. So there were a lot of don'ts and a lot of shame-based messages, not just sexually, but definitely sexually shame-based messages. And so here you are, realizing that your attraction is to men, and you're in an environment where you're taught that that's evil, wrong, sinful.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I noticed is that all along the way, you kept hoping for a new day.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
That would change you.
Yeah. It was...
and you could maybe name some of those things. It was like one...
Well, it was like, as a kid, I'd say like teenager, when I started having more of a sexual awakening. I remember thinking... Well, maybe if I remember being attracted to boys, feeling bad about that. And then I was like, well, maybe if I think about a girl as I masturbate. And then I was like, I felt even worse about that, because that had really been pounded into my head as, premarital sex and girls, you don't lust after girls. So then I was like, and two, I just didn't find any pleasure in it. So then I went back to the boys and I was like, well, hey, boys, rough house. I had all this justification in my head. And then I wasn't allowed to date. And so I got all the way through when I went to go to college, I told myself, okay, when you go to college, everything's going to be different. Because you're going to be in this Bible college, with all these young people who are also here to serve the Lord. And, I had a bit of a utopian mindset about what that was going to be like. And I thought, you won't want to do these things. You won't think these things because you'll be in the right kind of place, So then I got there, and then it was it
was a Baptist, fundamental college,
yes,
right? Okay, yeah. Yes. So same kind of environment that you grew up in.
It was slightly less conservative than what I grew up in, but still very, very conservative by anybody's standards. And so then it was getting into a dorm with gang showers and stuff certainly did not
right.
help. So then I'm like, well, I'll start dating. When I start dating, then I'll my attractions will be geared to her. And then it was, we didn't have sex. We didn't do any premarital sex or anything because that was a no-no. So then it was like, well, when we get married and I can have sex, then that will change everything. And then it was like, with every situation, nothing changed, but I always kept telling myself, well, then the next thing. And it was like, well, when I have kids, I'm going to feel so responsible as a parent and all that will change me. It was also when I get in ministry, because I was going into ministry, when I start working at a church, and it just was like that constantly. And this, you tell yourself that same lie over and over again because it feels like the only option you have. And you're like, well, okay, well, then that will change me. So that was the circular path I was on.
This table picks up vibrations really bad. So I forgot to tell you that at the beginning. So so you're always thinking like something will change me and I'll be quote normal, right, sexually, and my orientation will change. I mean, you probably didn't even think of it that way. You just probably thought you would.
Well, I mean, in those environments, any problem was a sin problem, right? So if it's a sin problem, then that means, God doesn't intend for me to live in sin, and he's made a way for me to escape from this temptation. So then it becomes something that I have to be able to overcome, because otherwise I'm saying God made me that way, which wasn't supposed to be.
Yeah.
So you just work on overcoming. So it's like, pray enough, do all the right things. So it was a journey of doing as much right as I could. And I was a very committed Christian. I really gave it my all.
Right. And that comes through. And you loved God.
Yeah.
You wanted to serve God with all your heart. You became a pastor.
Yeah.
You married. You have kids. You're doing you're the example of a godly family. Godly
I felt
man,
like it, yeah.
Godly, you're raising kids to love Jesus.
We were, well respected and looked up to, and but it was frustrating because nothing ever changed, not even one bit. So then after a while you start running out of ideas of what's next that I haven't already tried.
Right.
And my last ditch effort was when, two of my one before the last ditch, but was I decided to go plant a church. So we called that church planting, which was going somewhere, starting a church from scratch.
Right.
So I moved to the South Bend, Indiana area and started a small church in Granger, Indiana. Yeah. So moving to a brand new area where I didn't know anybody, I thought, okay, Joel, this is it. You now have a clean slate.
Were you being supported by your home church or the church that you were on staff
at? A lot of churches, yeah. I had gone, my family and I went around the country and raised monthly support to sponsor us.
I hear, I'm a church planner. I did the same. I raised my support,
And so I started this church, but moving there, I was like, okay, Joel, this is it. This is going to be your life's work. So, of course, I didn't use this language in my head at that time, but essentially I was saying, don't fuck it up. Because this is it. This is your last chance. Yeah. You're moving here. Nobody knows you. You don't know anybody. You don't know cruising spots. You don't know anything. Like, this is your opportunity.
Yeah.
With a clean slate to do everything right.
Right.
That worked for about 4 weeks.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you were back to your patterns of, of the...
That also coincided with the internet becoming a household item.
Yeah, yeah. Which changed the way you masturbated.
Yeah. Everybody changed everybody.
Even us, everybody's world.
It brought everything into the privacy of your own home.
Yeah, that's no matter what your orientation sexually, it changed.
It made it a lot easier to hide.
Yeah,
like back in the day, you always heard stories about some young person finding their dad's Playboy magazine somewhere. But
it was
the internet changed all of that.
Yeah. I mean, it was like. It was magazines or prior to the internet, it was magazines or porn shops somewhere or something like that, So one of your last ditch efforts, it seems to me like, was even beyond the church planting, was Exodus International.
Yeah.
Which is an I don't know how to term it, ex-gay type ministry.
Back in the day, Exodus International was the largest, what was labeled ex-gay ministry in the world. Ex-gay ministry was a term that was being used then. Today, you hear it referred to as conversion therapy, reparative therapy, lots of different things. And that movement has changed its name many times because every time it starts getting a bad reputation, they change the name again and call it something else and then deny that they were ever doing that. So my ex-gay counselors would say, we would never do conversion therapy.
Yeah.
But if you look at what they were doing, that's what it is.
That was the goal.
Yeah. So when I had a kind of my come to Jesus moment of coming face to face with myself.
Yeah.
Was I don't know if you want me to go into that story.
You're welcome to, because I wanted to. I there's a couple of places that in your story that just intersect my story, but this is one of them. That's interesting.
Cruising, for those that don't know what cruising is.
Yeah, explain that.
Is finding anonymous sexual encounters in parks, restrooms, public places. And I really like to clarify that the way that came about was not because it was some kind of kink. It wasn't, I get off by having sex in public. It's that it was the only safe place for someone who is closeted to go and find some relief.
Yeah.
And so it started way back in the day before, back in the many years ago, decades ago.
I mean, who would have known? Yeah.
You didn't go to if you couldn't be seen in a gay bar, or if there wasn't a gay bar, if you couldn't be seen in an adult bookstore or these kinds of places, well then gay men would usually find a park or some kind of place, and then that's where they would cruise for sex. It was portrayed by the media as like pedophilia, like there was these men lurking in the bushes that were going to grab your children when they walk by. It's like, no, that's not at all what was happening. This was closeted gay men, mostly closeted.
Yeah.
Gay men.
I'd say even mostly married.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Going out to find someone else that I could hook up with.
Right.
So that was, of course, really prevalent before the internet. With the internet, it became a little bit more like chat room hookups type stuff. And now, of course, you have apps and everything else, which is nothing more than cruising on a digital level.
Right.
But so anyway, I did a lot of cruising because that was my only safe place to get, which I hated myself for it, because I knew it was wrong and sinful and all of these kinds of things. And so, but yet it was like an addiction because the stress made me want to find relief. The relief would bring guilt and shame and more stress, which then, is like this circle that you just go around him. So, but anyway, I had made an arrangement with a guy I met online in a chat room back in the day when chat rooms were really popular. And we agreed to hook up. So we were going to meet. He lived we agreed to meet in a halfway point, which happened to be the parking lot of a Kmart. And so we had talked, and when in those days, especially as someone's closet, I was very careful not to share any kind of personal information, fake name. I didn't want anybody to know who it was or what I did.
Yeah, you're a pastor, a husband, and a father.
So I went to hook up with him in the parking lot, and something really strange happened. I got into his van and took a look at him, and I just had this overwhelming feeling, message, voice inside of me that just said, he's you. And I just looked at him and I was like, I felt this like, we're the same person, but I didn't know what it meant, you know? And I could tell that he kind of felt it too. There was just this like recognition, even though we'd never met. So we did the thing. And then afterwards, we started letting our guard down as we were talking and started kind of like, you tell me what you do, I'll tell you what I do kind of thing. Come to find out, there I am, Baptist pastor in this van with this guy, and he was the Methodist pastor.
Right. Married.
Yes, also married, kids. Yeah, pastoring. Yeah. Yep. And so in that moment, both of us kind of took a look at each other, and I realized, oh, that's what it was. I was looking in the mirror at myself when I looked at him. So we both were like, this is not who we want to be. This is not good for us from a career perspective, from a family perspective, from a personal perspective. So let's help each other get help. So he decided to go see a counselor somewhere, and I called Exodus International.
Okay.
I think I messaged
this
them.
was like 2000 maybe or something like that?
Around sometime, maybe 2001 or 2.
Yeah.
And I called Exodus International and
let me just interject,
because
so I started my church in 1990, and we were meeting in a middle school during the 90s, and I would have men, come to me who were in your situation, who sometimes would confess everything you just described to me for the first time, and they'd be, just crying because they had never shared it sometimes with anybody. Yeah. Married, in my church. And of course, I went to seminary in 79, 80, 81, 82, 83, and college in the early 80s, seminary in the mid 80s. We never talked once about any of this stuff. And then here in the 90s, I'm having these guys come, and usually guys coming and confessing this stuff to me. And I didn't know what to do. And I was glad they were in my church. I was glad they were there. I would express my love and pray for them. And then I would send them to something that was similar to Exodus International, which was called Living Waters at the time. Maybe even been associated with Exodus International. Probably.
Exodus was more of an umbrella organization that just connected everybody that was doing anything to help people not be gay. Right. And so it was more of a resource list, but they did have like annual conventions and speakers and stuff. But it was more about, we approve these people as a place for you to go and get help.
Get help. Yeah. And the help was to try to get you to not be gay.
Yeah. And the truth, it's not based in any kind of science or anything, any psychological science or anything. Yeah. So basically, if you said, bang your head against that bookcase 12 times and it'll make you straight, who am I to say that that's not accurate? So everybody did their own thing. Name everywhere you went. If you watch like the movie Boy Erased with Nicole Kidman and Russell Crowe, and I forget the young man who played, but it's a true story.
I haven't seen that one.
About a young man going through conversion therapy I think at Living Waters, honestly.
Boy Erased.
Yeah.
Okay.
And like in that movie, when I watched it, it was really hard for me to watch, honestly. I didn't think it would be, but it did really impact me. But there were things that took place in their therapies that I'm like, well, that didn't happen. But what was 100% accurate was the attitudes and the language that was used. So I'm like, oh, I totally relate to the attitudes and language. That's 100% accurate. I just didn't have somebody banging a Bible on my back, you know?
Yeah. And you went through it and got into therapy and with all your heart.
Oh yeah, because it was my last chance.
You wanted to pray the gay away. You spent your life trying to pray the gay away.
I knew this was it. If this didn't work, then there was no answer.
So when you finally, what brought you think, to finally just give up on that and accept who you were?
Almost 3 years.
Okay.
I felt like I was the poster boy of ex-gay therapy. I read the books, I went to conferences, I was in individual therapy, I was in group therapy. I was just trying to do everything.
Everything you could
Everything I could. Because I knew that was, I had to. That was my own. I mean, this is what this therapy is all about. So if I can't make this work, then nothing works. So I was doing all of that for almost 3 years. And I got to the point where I was like feeling really discouraged about it.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, nothing's really happening. Like, I don't feel that I'm any closer to being straight. Or if I was, I usually illustrate this visually. I'd be like, okay, so if this is all gay and this is all straight, so this is where I need to be, right? And after almost 3 years, I looked at my progress. It was like this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
like you'd inched away from gayness.
Maybe a centimeter.
Yes.
So I was like really discouraged about that, just thinking, this has got to get better. If it's not, I can't keep living like this.
And your self-hatred is probably just continuing to ratchet.
And
up,
I
right?
Were
you starting to get suicidal?
Yeah. During that time, it was very, very dark. I mean, I lost a lot of hope, which I'd always had. And during that time, I began to just feel like there is none. And I didn't want to kill myself, but I wanted somebody else to. So I was like, I didn't really want to.
I can relate to that for a different set of reasons. But
I would be like, I would fantasize about like, maybe I'll get hit by a car and die.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe this will happen.
Yeah.
And be like, that would be fine with me. As long as I'm dead, I don't want to live through it, So I felt terrible. So it was those, after those 3 years, I had been to a counselor in Indianapolis for a while, and then he referred me to a counselor closer to me. But the counselor in Indianapolis was kind of the director of the state of Indiana for Ixtus International. So I'm like, well, he's like high up in this organization, so to speak. And I'm like, he ought to have a huge database of people, right? Success stories and all. So I emailed him and I was like, hey, I'm getting really discouraged here. I don't feel like I'm making any kind of real progress. And I was like, so I wondered if you could connect me to some guys just like myself, not the national speakers that I've heard, but like just some real guys, down to earth guys who have been where I have been, have moved on and feel and would be willing to say, oh, Joel, bless your heart, hang in there. It's going to be so much better. I remember when I was worried, I just needed something. I needed some real people. And he emailed me back and told me he couldn't do that. And I said, well, why not? And he said, well, everybody kind of falls in one of two categories. One, this was a part of their life. Nobody ever knew about it. They got help in secret. They've moved on. That's a closed chapter. Don't talk about it because nobody should know it was ever a thing. Or they've came in, they got help, they've moved on, but they're afraid if they were to talk to you that they would fall right back into it. And so I literally, that day, he had wrote this in an email. I wish I still had it, but I don't. And I had printed it off. My ex-wife and I had separated at the time, and I was going to the house, I think, to pick up the kids. And I got there early, and the kids weren't home from school yet, and I was sitting out in the front yard on a stump or something. And I pulled that email, and I read it again. And I was just like, then I'm done. If those are my options, I'm going to spend the rest of my life living in fear that someone would find out, or shame, or fear that I'll fall back into it, or shame that somebody might find out. Yeah. No. Yeah. And I wadded up that paper, I threw it down, and I was like, I'm done. I am done. And I had a little conversation with God on that day, and just was like, hey, if you are who everybody says you are, then you know what's going on. You've been with me this whole time. You know how hard I've tried. You know me better than I know myself. You love me more than anybody else, so on and so forth. I just kind of repeated all of the things I've heard about God. Yeah. And then I was like, and you also know that I have tried it your way. What I was told was your way for a very long time now, all of my life. Yeah. So I am just letting you know, God, that from here on out, I am living as a gay man. I don't really know what that means, but I am not going back the way where I was from. Yeah. Yeah. And then I said, if you have a problem with it, you let me know. I'll be listening.
Wow. Yeah, man.
I remember having that conversation though with God. Like, and it was hard, but I was like, all right, we're just going to lay it all out there, and I'm not going to pretend anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. It's interesting because in the Exodus International world, there's an assumption that, God didn't make you gay, right? So there's got to be some other reason for your gayness. And they had a pretty limited set of
and
things.
that's still being used as criteria even to this day by many organizations, which is, did you have an overbearing mother?
Yeah.
Did you have an absentee or emotionally absent father?
Yeah.
Was there sexual abuse?
Right.
That's kind of it.
Yeah. Those three.
Yeah.
Has to be one of those three things because God didn't make you that way.
Right. Something caused it.
Right. So, so a couple of things that I found interesting, like in your book, you mentioned like when you were in therapy, and you mentioned that not all of the things that happened in your therapy were negative,
right?
But one of the things that struck me that I related to so much is because when I went through my meltdown, and then I've been in therapy and had to re-examine my whole. Actually, I've had to relook at my what I would call now shame-based sexual ethics. Okay, and I have one question before I get to shame-based sexual ethics, but in your book, which everybody, Godly But Gay, want to encourage you to check it out. The way we grew up, we weren't really allowed to have feelings.
No.
Right?
There was judgment.
And sometimes in our family context, sometimes in our religious context. And you said feelings, I had been taught, were not to be trusted. It's in your book, page 42, all right? Anger was sinful. Sadness was discontentment with God. Happiness was self-serving and fleeting at best. Resentment was a lack of forgiveness. Confusion was the lack of seeking and knowing God. Anxiety was the result of not accepting the peace of God. And we could go on.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. And you're like, so basically, you can't be human.
No, you can't.
Right?
I mean, that was what happened in my very first session of ex-gay therapy. This is what was good in the sense that I needed someone to ask me these questions. But, he'd say, well, tell me a little bit about your upbringing. And I would tell some story. And then he was like, well, how did you feel about that? And I would say, I don't know. How should I feel about it? And he'd be like, well, there's no should. Just like, what did you feel? And I'm like, I don't know. Should I be angry about that?
Yeah.
I was so disconnected to feelings that I needed someone to tell me how to feel and what was allowed to feel and so on and so forth. I didn't know that you could just have feelings.
Yeah, and I felt like I was in a battle with my negative feelings all the time, and I had plenty of them, and so my job was to suppress them, fight them, not give in to them, and then when it all fell apart, and I'm just shattered, and all I have is like shitty feelings, and then I started trying to do therapy and the feeling wheel, and I started reading about emotional intelligence, literally about my own, and I started doing mindfulness meditation, which is a lot about, checking into your body, your emotions, your thoughts, trying to become an observer, and so I've had to go through a whole, education process of, well, what are these feelings and how do I label them and what is this feeling? Where does it come from?
Well, just giving yourself that permission
to feel. Permission. There's a good book, Permission to Feel, Mark Brackett, and he and Brene Brown are trying to actually get emotional education into public schools at very young ages now because of the lack of that, right? Mm-hmm. And then if you're thrown into a religious context, which it's all sinful.
Yeah.
It's like, well, and just the emotions are sinful.
That's like hard part, or the really challenging thing about mixing in religion with all of these things, whatever you mix it into. And because when you attach godly values, all that kind of stuff to things, that really messes with people. Because it becomes a judgment call on everything.
Yeah.
I grew up feeling that there was an answer for everything.
Right.
And
A right one.
yes, and everything was either black or white, and there was no gray. And when I finally started, coming out and coming to terms with stuff, I realized the world is mostly gray. Mm-hmm. It's not black and white.
Right. Yeah. My two favorite words are paradox and mystery these days.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and it's okay. I had to come to terms with this phrase, but it helped me a lot, and that was, it's okay not to know.
Yeah. Unknowing.
Yeah.
Uncertainty.
It's like, it's all right.
It's okay. Yeah. Whew. Yeah. I've had to embrace those things too. But it's not been easy for me.
No, it's hard.
I've been a theologian my whole life and taught the Bible
come
my
from
whole life.
absolutes.
So, yeah. So sexual ethics. So I've come to the conclusion that I was rooted and based and raised, in a religious environment that was what I would call now shame-based sexual ethics. Mm-hmm. And, if I had to put it in a really tight package, my sexual ethics was, so God made sex, and if you're in a heterosexual marriage, you can do it and enjoy it. But if you're not in a heterosexual marriage, you can't do it, and you can't think about it.
Mm-hmm. It's pretty standard.
And then I realized that pretty much as a pastor, I'm thinking, but that I had embraced that for myself even. Mm-hmm. And then as a pastor, if I ever taught on sexuality, which I did sometimes, I would be trying to, I realized nobody lives up to this, including myself.
Including the people in the Bible.
Including people in the Bible. So then how do I talk about sexual ethics in a way that is grace-based? But now I've come to the conclusion that it's impossible. Even just to state that kind of standard makes everybody a failure, and I think worse, it causes people to not embrace their true humanity, which includes sexuality. So now I've tried to rethink my sexual ethics from what I might call a grace-based sexual ethic that embraces our humanity and our sexuality. And I've come up with some thoughts on that, but I'm curious where you thought about just sexual ethics today.
There's a really good book that I would highly recommend called The Ethical Slut.
Okay.
So good. It will kind of blow your mind in that sense.
Okay.
And I don't, in my mind, when two people are in agreement.
Mutual consent.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There you go.
And they're adults.
End of story.
Right? Maybe
do your thing.
Age of consent, yes. Mutual consent kind of idea.
If we all were raised to just accept who we are, then how different the world would be. Because the problems arise, and it's usually, honestly, all of the rules, all of the obstacles that are put up are usually religious based. Mm-hmm. And if you took that away, mm-hmm. I'll give you a personal example. So mm-hmm. I was addicted to cruising. Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, I could not go anywhere without. I could go to a brand new town, and within 15 minutes, I could tell you where the cruising spots were.
Yeah, yeah.
I knew how to look for it. My eyes were tuned for it. I knew the behavior, so on and so forth. And I would cruise. And then when the internet came along, oh wow, I could hook up several times a day if I wanted to. Mm-hmm. So I was so into that mm-hmm. and that sexual behavior, which I wasn't real proud of, but it was a drive.
Right.
And when I came out and I said, okay, I'm going to live as a gay man. And I realized now I can have all the sex I want with anybody I want. It was amazing though. Once I gave myself permission to do that,
yeah, that
so much just kind of melted off of me. That drive of sex just kind of melted away. And I started going, oh, well, now that I can actually make choices. I don't have to just take any opportunity that I can snatch up. It's like I can make choices. And I think if we translate that in the real world, and instead of saying, no, here are all your parameters, you got to live within these. If we said, what do you want to do?
Yeah.
And how are you going to manage this?
Right.
How does this fit into your life and your life plan and the people you love and care about? Then make choices that are going to be good for you. And I think we would find a balance.
I think
that we don't see today.
Yeah, and I think, I've thought about like raising, if I ever had kids, how would I raise them in a grace-based, human affirming sexuality? And that's what I'd want to do, right? Is raise my kids that way.
Right.
And so that's how I've tried to come at a sort of a new sexual ethic. And of course, love, I think, is, mutual consent, treating people with human dignity,
right.
respect.
Yeah.
There's a heart maybe for, I'm not saying that there can't be just two people enjoying sex, but at the same time, that there's not a part of it that is demeaning somebody or taking,
And we are humans with sexual desires. We are erotic by nature. We are attracted to things, and it's the barriers to it. That creates the mystique.
Yeah.
And the fantasy.
Yeah.
And then, but once you kind of start removing those, people generally speaking, I know some people wouldn't agree with this, but I think people know what's best for them.
Yeah.
And when you trust them to make good choices, doesn't mean people will always make good choices.
Right.
They don't. We know this about human beings. But generally speaking, it's kind of like European television and movies versus American television and movies. Here, we get so excited because whatever the new show is, there's a little bit of nudity in it. And it's very sexual. It's, you'll see screenshots, whereas in Europe, nudity is just a part of the storyline, and it's not sexualized.
Even beaches are topless, and kids
and
grow up around that.
We sexualize it, and then that just creates inordinate, in my mind, desires, so to speak.
I remember there was a book came out when I was pastoring called Every Man's Battle.
Yeah, I remember that book.
And I read it, and it was trying to teach guys to wake up every morning and try to live their whole day without any sexual stimulus whatsoever. Like if there's a cleavage on a TV, you better get rid of your TV. Or if there's cleavage in a magazine, better get rid of it. Or if there's, I was reading, I was going, I don't want to spend my whole day thinking about, what I don't like, what I'm trying not to do. And then that's my focus all day long, is not thinking lustful thoughts. Well, then it just throws me into that's what I'm thinking about all day long.
That's what I was experiencing.
If I see a beautiful woman, I want to recognize the beauty. If I see something, hot, I want to say, oh, wow, that's hot. I didn't want to live my life in this negative framework of trying to avoid every kind of sexual stimulus.
I never thought about sex more than when I was in XK therapy, trying not to think about sex.
Exactly. And you read the stats on young men, how often they think about sex every day. It's like every few seconds or something. It's like they have a sexual thought, and maybe some women do too, but I certainly know a lot of men do. And
women do too.
And
I remember thinking, my XK therapy was a lot of behavior modification. So they'd be like, avoid driving by this place, avoid the places that are tempting. And I'm like, you don't understand.
Every place is tempting.
There's not a place that's not tempting. I literally one day pulled up to a stoplight, looked over at the guy in the car next to me. He looked at me. We followed each other to a restroom and had sex.
Oh, God.
So I'm like, how do I avoid that? Put me in a concrete room with no windows, I don't know.
Hungry Eyes, that's a song, right?
Yes, exactly. But I'm like, it was just so stupid to think about trying to control that, because again, all you're doing is you're thinking about it even more. It's like saying, I'm not going to think about pie, no pie today. I'm not going to think about pie, not apple, not cherry, not peach. And what are we doing? We're all thinking about pie now.
Yeah. And if there is a God who created us and he put that in us, and then we're going to live our whole life feeling shameful about it, it's craziness, right? So I'm just thinking, we've got to teach our kids how to live, how to affirm their sexual desires in a healthy way. That's like, hey, this is part of being human, and love yourself, self-compassion, openness, curiosity.
I mean,
not like trying to battle your humanity your whole stinking life.
In the same way that, like, you know, you take your kids to the Grand Canyon, you want them to enjoy seeing the Grand Canyon. You're going to say, now be careful, right? You can go up to the edge, but stay behind the fence. You know, what are you doing? You're training them that if you're not careful, you could fall off and die.
Right.
So in the same way that you train it, but you don't say, we're not going to the Grand Canyon because you could fall off and die. You know, you go and you say, here are the parameters.
There's some healthy boundaries.
Yeah. And you figure out what's going to be best for you. Do you want to die? Well, probably not. Then you probably should stay away from the edge.
So I'm going to write a memoir one of these days, and one of my chapters is going to be on sexual ethics, and I've just been thinking through, you know,
you'll enjoy the ethical slut.
I'll check that out. I had another one recommended to me by a black gay Presbyterian pastor, and I looked it up, and it was actually really good too. I'm blanking on the name of it now, but any rate, I had another couple of thoughts here before we run out of time. When I read the story of your dad, after your mother had died, your dad's living alone, and you're coming to your mother's funeral. Is that what it was, or you're coming?
The story was actually my mother was dying, and she was in a nursing home, and Dad was living at the house by himself, and she was in the nursing home, but her days were very numbered at that point in time.
And by the way, I mean, I don't want you to dive into this, but your family largely rejected you once you came out.
Yes.
Including your siblings and your mom and dad. And your dad had hardly talked to you about this. Yeah. But at the end of his life, when your mother's in this nursing home type facility, you and your husband come to visit your mom.
Yeah.
And you were nervous as heck about it.
Yeah, that was, you know, hey, Mom's dying, we should probably go see her. So
I'll let you tell it, but when you told me what your dad did when I was reading the book, I started crying.
Yeah.
Literally, I'm got tears running down my face because you said it was the kindest thing your dad ever did.
Yeah, it was truly a gift.
And I thought about love is really what it's all about love, you know, and maybe you want to just share that,
well, I mean, I think just my dad was so, my parents were so conservative and had spent their lives stripping away anything that could have brought them joy or pleasure to get closer to God. And I think my dad was like, they were okay not having a relationship with me because it was some kind of separation. You know, it was like, well, he's sinning. He's not getting, you know, so we can't have a relationship with him. And I think as my mom was passing, my dad started to think, well, here I am. He and Mom both were at the end of their lives, really, because he died just a few months after my mom. And I think he had a realization that he had alienated people that could have loved him. And here at the end of his life, I think maybe he was wondering if it had all been worth it, really. And so when my husband and I, if you want me to tell the story, I can, but
I would love for you to.
All right.
Yeah.
I might get teary as well because this still makes me teary.
Yeah.
So I'm like, okay, David, we're going to go to Effingham. We're going to visit Mom. And so we booked a hotel. I called Dad and said, hey, we're coming down. And I'm bringing my partner, David. We weren't married at the time, but we were together. And I said, I'm bringing my partner, David. We're coming down to visit Mom because I know she's not doing well. And so he was like, okay. So on the way down, I kept telling David, I was warning him of everything that was going to take place. Dad will confront us. Dad's going to have lots to say. He's going to try to, you know, who knows what's going to happen, you know. So about a few minutes outside of Effingham, my dad called me and he was like, can you stop by the house before you go? And I was like, yeah, we'll do that. So we stopped by the house, and David and I, it was the first time he'd ever met David. I knew that he probably knew David existed because my siblings all knew, even though they don't have a relationship with me. And I'm sure the talk of the family had been that Joel is now dating someone. And we came in, and my dad was very gracious. He greeted David, and we sat down in the living room and talked And he did like anybody would do. He got to know David. He asked him questions about where he worked, and we sat and chatted and everything. And I kept sitting there thinking, what is going on here? This is not like when's the shoe going to drop? Because I knew my dad to be very confrontational. And so finally, about an hour and a half in, I was like, well, Dad, we're going to head to the hotel now, and we'll meet up in the morning for breakfast and go see Mom. And he looked and he said, well, that sofa pulls out into a bed. You're welcome to stay here tonight. And it felt like time froze in that moment. I was just kind of like, wait, did my dad just say it was okay for me to sleep at his house in the same bed with my partner? I just was like, it almost didn't compute. I'm like, he does understand that we're together, right? Like all of this kind of stuff. So I just said, well, Dad, thank you, but we've already booked a hotel, so we're going to go there. And David and I just walked out and both of us like, what just happened? I couldn't believe it. And then the next day after we saw Mom and before we left, we were at his house. I were at the nursing home, I believe, at that time. And he was like, you're welcome anytime in my home.
Wow.
And I think that my dad realized he had sacrificed a relationship for his idea of what it meant to be a godly man. Mm. And I think he was regretting it. And it felt like such a gift for him to offer those things. Mm. I felt like I got the closure that I needed. I'm sad that it had to happen just a few months before he passed because we never really got to build upon that. Mm-hmm. But I think we could have.
Yeah.
Had he lived, I think we might have actually had a relationship. But it was a beautiful gift and a beautiful moment in life for both David and I.
I thank you for sharing that story. That's beautiful. You a line that you brought up about your experience with the church. Maybe this was in your letter, your letter to the church, which I thought I'd encourage every pastor in America to read your letter to the church. I'd encourage them to read your book, but then focusing on that letter to the church, because, gosh, if we could hear that, and then reorient ourselves to actually loving people. My new favorite verse, how we memorize verses all the time. I've only memorized one verse in the last 3 years of my meltdown, but it's God is love. Those who live in love live in God, and God lives in them. Yeah. So if there's a God, which I've felt like an atheist at times in this last few years of my life, but that's emotionally how I felt like even God. It's just that's been this emotional thing, but love to me is everything. There's nothing else in this world to live for. Love, beauty, creativity, forgiveness. I don't want to be a bitter, resentful person. But you had this phrase about, you felt like you had a lot of people who were hating me with the love of Christ.
Yeah.
And I thought, God, because in a lot of ways that little love the sinner, hate the sin, it's really kind of like hating people with the love of Christ, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's really not love in it.
No, it's not at all.
There's really not.
That's my siblings. I always say they hate me with the love of Christ.
They've actually said that?
No, I say that.
Yeah, okay.
That is the best way to describe it. Like they think they're being loving.
But I get it. Yeah. Like when you judge people harshly, somehow you're being true to the truth.
Right.
And that's the most loving thing you can do, is be true to the truth. Mm-hmm. So even if it smashes somebody to death and crushes them, and you reject them at their very core of who they are, you're loving them.
It's all out of love, though.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm. And you're just like, holy crap. It's rejecting people at the core of who they are. I wish I had a little more time. I've had a challenging time having conversations with a few of my friends who think that their battle with lust, like a heterosexual guy, it's battle with lust, and he has to resist his lust, and that. So, like, if you have a gay orientation, well, you should have just battled your lust and been faithful to your wife and your kids. And it's the same, like, they want to put it in the same thing. And I've tried to come up with analogies to help people who are in that framework. I can't get through to. I'm having a hard time with that. Like, how do I help people? Because I've listened to enough stories now to get how core and central our sexual identity is, and even who we're oriented to love and lust over.
Yeah.
It's a part of who we are.
The problem with that is that it reduces us to sex. Being gay is not limited to who you have sex with, who you lust after. So if it's like, in that sense, yeah, I mean, I could be lusting after that chair over there, I mean, but that's not what it is. It that reduces everything to just sex. And a lot of, especially religious people, want to make being gay out. They care about who you have sex with. They're so concerned about that. There are certain conversion therapy type groups that say it's okay to be gay, just don't act on it.
Yeah, I ran into that all the time.
And I'm like, you could be, being gay is not about who you have sex with. It's so much more than that. It's your core identity. This is why we have pride flags. It's not because we want to say, hey, look at me, I have sex with men. It's saying, I am a homosexual, I am trans, I am bi, I am lesbian, and that is the core of who I am. Whether I ever have sex with anybody or not, I could be completely celibate and still be gay.
Yeah, right.
So don't reduce me down to who I have sex with.
Yeah. And I think the science is coming on board with this.
Oh, yeah.
Pretty clearly, I've been listening to some interesting ones that even it's even more complicated than just the chromosomes, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you've got.
I mean, I have 3 children, and at least 2 of them identify as queer. So I don't know. I can't say that's scientific, but it sure beats the odds, doesn't it?
Yeah. It does. It does. So it's. Anyway, I think it's something,
honestly, I don't try to change anybody's mind, because if they're not seeking to understand, there is no changing.
Yeah.
So I just let people go. I'm like, we're not even going to have that conversation because it's not worth it.
Yeah.
Now, if they're saying, help me understand this, that's different.
That's different, right?
But if it's, well, what about this? Yeah. And what about this? That's just an argument.
Right. Well, I still have hope for some of my huge people that have loved me through the years, and friends in the evangelical world. You can't imagine how many thousands and thousands of people I love and friends and family who are in that, in the evangelical world. And I've been a part of sort of my professors would have called me a British evangelical, which to them was a progressive evangelical, which, I was fine with that. But I think I've listened to so many stories where the church has inflicted so much harm.
Yeah.
And I would feel like I did, I would have to own up to being a part of that at certain times, even though it wasn't my heart. My heart was always to love people, but I didn't understand everything. And I've listened to enough stories now to realize that affirming people for who they are at the core of their being is a part of how I think Jesus wants us to love, and we don't even have to throw Jesus into it. It's just part of how, as Frank Schaeffer would say, the survival of the friendliest, and he would put it even into, he's really looking at the evolutionary track of love in relationships, and how that's really the key to evolution is love and friendship. I
really noticed when I was coming out of the church and all, and I started hanging out with people that had like no religious background. Like my husband grew up irreligious.
Okay.
Was never part of really anything.
Isn't it refreshing sometimes to meet people
I
that way?
have found the most balanced, wonderful people are the people that have the least amount of religion in their background. And they'd be like, oh,
even
they're just interested. They're curious. And they're like, tell me more. And
yeah, even as a pastor, that's who I enjoyed actually hanging out with when I was pastoring, was that crowd,
I really started picking up on that. I was like, these people are amazing. Like, there's just no judgment. There's no hang-ups. They're just curious. Tell me more. They like to learn. Yeah. And I'm like, and I started realizing all of these people grew up really with no real particular religious background.
Yeah. Well, my encouragement would be to, even if in your mind you're listening to this, you're like, I don't know, man. Doesn't the Bible say, or this or that or the other? Just get to know, hear some stories, read your book, and maybe recommend a couple of quick movies for people that you think are really help open up the heart of the matter.
Boy Erased would be one.
Boy Erased.
There's a document. If you want to learn about ex-gay conversion therapy, there's another documentary, Pray Away, which is good. But there's a lot of even just dramatic stories, about people and their relationships. I think to circle way back, and that is when I was in the church, I realize now why I was hearing stuff about gays. It was always out on the West Coast. It was always this picture painted of out there, those people, or New York City.
San Francisco.
Yeah, and I realized, that's because Stonewall had just happened, if not that much earlier. So the gay rights movement was coming into the forefront. And the church did well as long as it was always this picture of these people out there that was the only addressing of it I ever heard. And it was this us against them mentality. Yeah. And I am a firm believer in our stories and telling our stories. I agree. Because you can't, one of the reasons things are changing in our society right now is because it's no longer those people out there. It's my uncle, my aunt, my school, my kid's teacher, my whatever. And it's suddenly, I really like this person and they happen to be different than me.
Right.
So what do I do with that? Do I just have to start disliking them now?
Right.
And so, and then hearing the stories, and that's what I tell. I don't get into theological debates with churches and stuff, but if somebody wants me to come and speak, and I have spoken in some somewhat conservative circles, and I'm always like, look, all I want you to do is just listen to my story. I'm going to tell you my story, and when I'm done, I ask them, so now that you've heard all of this, everything that I've done, tried, what did I do wrong? What was I missing? Was it I just didn't pray one more prayer enough? I didn't try just a little bit harder? Like, really, is that what you're going to say? Because as you can see, I did it all. So please tell me, what did I miss? Yeah. Why didn't it work? And that's where I want people to just stop and listen to a story as a human being.
Yes.
And realize that everybody's journey is different. And in a sense, it makes no difference whatsoever what's going on in my world, in my life. My rights, my existence should not threaten yours.
Yeah.
And it doesn't.
Well, we've run out of time, but how do people find you? And thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for the courageous, I just thank you for being courageous.
Absolutely.
I appreciate it. And I love you. And I appreciate you.
That.
I want to read one paragraph from your book at the end, because I love the way you talked about how we never know how we influence other people. And you left, that was a beautiful thing of how we're interconnected and how much we influence. If we can just influence people with love, and remember that the biggest thing we leave with them is how we make people feel. I thought that was really good. You say all the world's a stage. We each have a role. Surrounding us are a cast of characters who need us more than even they realize. Before you make your moves and speak your lines, remember they may not remember what you said or did, but they will remember how you made them feel.
Yeah, so true. That's pretty good. I'm glad I wrote that.
Got to get this book.
You can get it at joelspeaksout.com. It is available on Amazon as well, although I make more money off if you order it from my website, but I won't be upset if you, however you get it. But joelspeaksout.com is where you can order that, as well as some other merchandise that I have there. And connect with me. Be happy to hear from you.
All right. Thanks so much for being on Spirituality Adventures. Thanks for sharing your story. Everybody, thanks for tuning in to Spirituality Adventures, and we will see you next time. This concludes today's episode. Thanks for tuning in and listening. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Remember to like, share, or subscribe to the social media platform that you're using. And then go to our website, spiritualityadventures.com, and make a one-time donation, or you can subscribe monthly and receive our special bonus content. Thanks so much.